It's obvious that we could pick up where we left off, but why not? I mean, Pierre and Mike. Mike is wanting to set up the community, and Mike, one thing we did not say was the video of this event will eventually make its way onto Orama, is that correct?
That is correct.
And it will be therefore publicly available as soon as we've got it there under Creative Commons stuff, so under Creative Commons license, which is what Orama runs under now.
I know I didn't mention that, but it is running a
Describe what Creative Commons is, Mike.
Well, there's different types of Creative Commons licenses. The one in particular that Orama runs on is a, I can't remember off the top of my head, but you're not allowed to basically, if you contribute or use anything, you can't use that for commercial gain. You can reference, and yeah, there's loads of other legislation I won't go into, but yes, it's basically where you can share and share alike between participants.
Properly acknowledged. It's us as a community may refer to it. Well, are there any issues raised by the two presentations this afternoon from Mike and Pierre? The idea of Mike's community, currently a private community, but soon to be a bit more public, and Pierre's software. Slowly but steadily, my observation of Pierre a moment ago over there was that it's opening out. In other words, I'm thrilled by the fact that you might be able to create your own analytical events. And actually, that's something that I think I'm very keen on doing, is that it's not just going to be the usual suspects analytical lists. You're going to be able to create your own and see how that works. Any questions or issues you wish to raise from these two presentations, then we can generalize by all means.
Yeah, I have a...
Yeah, Odin.
I think there is something, I mean, visual representation has been a long time part of what analysis meant. And I think there is something that visual representation allows sort of an architectural view of the music sort of from above, from beyond, from external. So, which does give you a lot of interesting things about, you know, in a sense, trying to grasp the entire music in a, you know, in a microsecond or simultaneously. But it doesn't. I think it doesn't address this sort of what we talk about, the experiential nature of it. Because the experiential nature has to be from within, right? It can't be from without. And it's interesting that these very all the analysis that we saw in the last 2 hours was about sort of the architectural approach.
Elaborate your own question. The part of our afternoon's whole day's discussion is what tools could address what you have just discussed.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer.
Ah, okay. Fair enough.
But I don't. I think there needs to be some kind of, it's a bit of a, need to cross beyond. I mean, the architectural does give you something that just listening doesn't. Mm-hmm. But how do you link it back to actually experiencing things?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, just two brainstorms in response to that. In fact, one thing, Simon, I showed you sometime this last year. Somewhere online, someone has this thing for visualizing notated music. It's scanning left to right. The current time is right in the middle of the screen. But what's nice about it has this magnetization effect. So the notes actually snap into the now and then go away. And something about that really struck me as compelling, because certainly in certain kinds of music, where we're talking teleological music, where there's goal-directed, and there is this chargedness of the present that all of a sudden falls into a new event. Right? Well, you know, how could a visualization reflect that? And another thing that occurs to me is the role of memory. And I sometimes imagine this thing, again, maybe the idea of something scrolling, time is scrolling to the right, but you have these ghosts of things that have already happened. There's something about the traces of memory, and of course some things are going to leave stronger traces than others and remain there in this timeline more present. But that's just brainstorming.
Michael?
Just following on from that, it's a great problem. It's trying to do a keynote speech when you're taking part in something. You haven't written it before you start, you've been told not to, and then you're taking part in something and you keep contributing things which might have been part of it. So I don't know what I'm going to end up saying at the end. But anyway, I too have been very sceptical about not visual things in total, but the extent to which they're used. I think they've been used far too much and without enough thought in a lot of analyses of all music, perhaps, but particularly of electroacoustic music, and they do emphasise certain aspects. One solution I've tried, which I think I've tried to implement, which I think is also what Pierre's been doing, is to combine the visual with the audio. So, for instance, to have paradigmatic charts that are there visually on the screen in software, but that chart is also something you can click on and you can actually hear it. So you can see the structure, but then you can immediately hear the shape of whether it's wind chimes or Mortius Plango or whatever piece I've been analysing. And likewise with the sonogram, again I've done a version and Pierre's done one where you can see the sonogram, but it's not just a sonogram printed on a page, it's one you can interact with orally. So I think that combination of the oral with the visual goes at least some way to resolving some of the problems, but it does still tend to present a certain way of seeing the music and undertaking the analysis, I think.
I would, again, as in Oded's case, I personally feel that we're not representing what you might call processes either. That is things which, somebody who's not here, I'm forgetting who at the moment, he's trying to come to the next seminar, Gary from Northern Ireland.
Gary Kendall.
Gary Kendall. I had a long conversation with him about the fact that he said if you have a long-held sound, right, it doesn't change. But it changes in your perception, all right, because you're very bored with it at the end. So it's represented as this solid object, kind of quasi-objectively. It is in fact not what you perceive at all. And he says that it's a very perceptive thought that is not represented in the current representation order, for example. John?
Yeah, isn't that the perennial problem with visual representation, which I think has a place? If I go back to, this is probably the wrong frame for it, but Schenker in his analysis said, look, the graph of the Euler linear should stand for itself, and then he gave a verbal explanation of it. He always accompanied it by a verbal explanation. And what you were saying there, that's true of this solid long line, but then presumably you supplement it by a verbal explanation, which strikes me as an entirely valid and indeed possibly even necessary thing to do. I was actually interested in was it your étude chemin de fer? Yeah, I mean, you had to make a judgment on whether that was a Y sound, an X sound. That came from one's experience. The composite sounds at the bottom.
That took a long time, yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. Once again, that presumably would be supplemented by some kind of verbal supplement to that. And that strikes me as an ideal combination of those two. Presumably left on its own, something that you never intended.
It's quite hard to decode otherwise.
Yeah, I know.
So you're saying we just can't be monomodal? This is.
I think it'd be difficult. I'm trying to think of examples where I think it's been successful, and if it's eluded people like Schenker, I'm sure it's going to probably elude us as well.
And why would you want to be monomodal when there is so much more we can do as well? And that's what struck me, the ability of layering things. You know, we're not in an either-or situation anymore. We have the ability to put probes down through several layers of analysis, different contexts.
Absolutely. Yes, completely.
A lot of the visualization, in fact, all visualization methods and software seem to focus on sound as events, and so representing spatiality is a whole different world that doesn't seem to be possible at the moment. I've thought of different ways of, for example, dealing with spectral space in a visual way, and potentially the way that spectral space is interacting with perspectival space and in time also makes it very complicated and, if not impossible, to visually represent, which makes me think whether it's actually valid that the visualization of such a complex multidimensional aspect of listening is valid at all.
Well, valid, it's not done for its own sake. I think the group has agreed on this for a long time. So what's it for is back to our very first question. I mean, what do you want to visualize a spectral space for? To explain it to somebody, or to just come with grips?
If it's a pertinent aspect of my experience of music, then surely that's what I want to analyze.
Okay. Was it Rick? Was that a hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, being multimodal seems to me to be beside the point. I mean, to not be multimodal, in that analysis should be approachable from all different modes, especially the one that the piece is not in. Although analyzing it within itself by, say, another piece is also another valid way to go about it. So something like eAnalyze tries to approach it from a lot of different perspectives and gives you the choice of why are we analyzing this piece. So you can choose what modes you want to work in order to get to a certain place. And why being, it just depends upon on the goal of that particular project. Mm-hmm. And once you state what those outcomes need to be, then you can choose what modes of analysis you want to use to get there.
Yeah.
And, well, what modes, plural, you want to use to get there.
Absolutely. Georgina.
Just to be difficult, the problem is that if you have very, very powerful visual representations, you know, the tools also form what we do, and that tends to prefer to put to the forefront a certain approach, a certain way of conceptualizing, and so on, and then other modes of experience drop away. So, you know, we can be kind of relativist and additive and say, well, let's keep supplementing, but there is an effect to the tools that we use. You know.
Mm-hmm. The tools aren't neutral. They're going to reflect back on practice.
And there, you know, a number of the things we saw this morning could never, ever be represented in any, you know, except, yeah, it was, at one point you said in the future, I want to add, it was a lovely moment, I wanted to ask you, you said something, I want to add a view of an installation. And I felt like saying, what view? Yeah, I mean, it's a great idea, you know, maybe film would give us something, you know.
Yes.
But,
well,
yes, in future version, the idea is to add other view. You can add a map of the installation. If you have a camera, you can have the video or several video from several point of view. It will be possible.
So we could have had, we could just feed the video of John and Neil from this morning in there. We'll stripe the video across will come the audio. And we can analyse, he mentioned John Bowers, his analysis of the movements on his table sheet, as he calls it. And he gets all these stuff and he analyses his own movements. So we could do that on the video track and then compare that with the audio track, for example. Dennis?
I mean, one of the problems, the big problem I see is that there are certain works in terms of the tools that we have that are more analysable than others. So, and in fact we're governed, I suppose, in the works that we choose for analysis by the facility with which we can use the tools that exist. So that's the question of analysability. I just pose it as a question because I think there are certain kinds of works, certain configurations of sounds that are not so easily analysable. And the question of segmentation is obviously uppermost on that. But then spatial things or spatiality is one. We don't have a very, very good vocabulary yet for textures. Spectral space, which is a subjective interpretation of how the spectrum is used. It's not a literal sonogram representation. All these kinds of things resist really the means of representation that we have at the moment. So they're more liable to be avoided in analysis, I would have thought. They're challenges, but they're more liable to be avoided, even when they're an important part of the piece.
So does that link to what Georgina just said? In a sense, you're saying the tools came from a certain tradition.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise, they reflect it. Well, that's Schenker again, isn't it? It works well from the tradition from which he came.
Yes, I agree with Georgina.